It's a cold night in the Zulu kingdom. The moon hangs low, casting long shadows across the royal homestead. Inside one of the huts, two men lean close, their whispers sharper than the spears resting by the doorway. Dingane and Mhlangana, brothers of the most feared man in southern Africa, are plotting the unthinkable. Not a cattle raid, not a war campaign, something far riskier. They are planning to kill their own brother, Shaka Zulu. Now, pause for a moment. Imagine being in their sandals. This isn't some ordinary sibling rivalry. This isn't he stole my toy or he ate the last piece of meat. This is our brother is the most powerful, paranoid, battle-hardened ruler on the continent. And if we fail, we die instantly. So the whispers continue. One says, he's slipping. The kingdom grows restless. He's too dangerous now. The other nods, knowing that even their breaths feel like betrayal in the night air. Because here's the problem. How do you kill the man everyone else believes is unstoppable? How do you betray someone whose very name makes armies tremble? How do you stab the lion in his own den and live to tell the tale? This is not just a story about death. It's about power, fear, and a kingdom that reached its boiling point. Tonight, we unravel the final hours of Shaka Zulu, the man who built an empire with his bare hands, only to be undone by the hands of his own family. But before we get to that fatal night, we need to answer one burning question. How did Shaka rise so high that even his death had to be staged like a war campaign? To understand the day Shaka died, you first have to understand the boy who was never supposed to live. Shaka wasn't born with a crown on his head. In fact, he was born into scandal. His father, Senzangakona, was chief of the Zulu, but Shaka's mother, Nandi, wasn't officially recognized as his wife. That made young Shaka a child born out of order. In a society where lineage and legitimacy were everything, this meant rejection, shame, and humiliation. If African soap operas existed back then, Shaka's childhood would have been Season 1, Episode 1, complete with family feuds, village gossip, and the kind of drama that makes you want to throw popcorn at the screen.
As a child, Shaka was mocked and bullied. Villagers gave him cruel nicknames. He walked barefoot, hungry, often cast aside. But here's the thing about underdogs. They pay attention. They learn. And Shaka was learning the brutal lessons of survival from day one. When he came of age, he was drafted into a military regiment under a neighboring kingdom, the Mthethwa. This was his turning point. Picture the scrawny kid who always got picked last in childhood games, suddenly discovering he's the best athlete in the league. Shaka didn't just survive training, he reinvented it. He noticed how battles dragged on with thrown spears, more about who had good aim than who had real guts. Shaka introduced something terrifying, the short stabbing spear, the Iklwa. Why Iklwa? Because that was the sound it made when you pulled it out of someone's chest. Efficient, deadly, personal. He didn't stop there. He drilled warriors to fight in close combat, shoulder to shoulder, with large cowhide shields. He perfected the famous bullhorn formation, surrounding enemies like cattle in a kraal until there was no escape. It was ruthless, it was brilliant, it was game-changing. And here's the twist. Shaka wasn't just a warrior, he was magnetic, charismatic. People followed him not only out of fear, but also out of awe. He had the kind of presence that made men want to fight harder and women want to sing his praises. He was, in every sense of the word, larger than life. Soon, he rose from commander to king, seizing the Zulu throne with fire in his eyes and vengeance in his heart. And once in power, he didn't just build an army. He built an empire. Small clans that once laughed at the rejected boy now trembled when they heard his name. The outcast had become unstoppable. The underdog had become the overlord. By the time Shaka reached his peak, his legend was so fearsome that killing him wasn't just about murder, it was about rewriting the destiny of a people. And that's exactly what made the whispers of betrayal so dangerous. When Shaka finally secured the Zulu throne, he didn't just sit down and enjoy his kingdom like a man with a nice piece of land and a cold drink. No, he looked at the kingdom and thought, "This is too small. Let's make it bigger, much bigger." And bigger it became. Under his leadership, the Zulu weren't just another clan. They became the most feared military machine in South Africa. His army didn't march, it thundered. His warriors weren't just fighters, they were human weapons, trained with military discipline that would make even Roman generals nod in approval.
Shaka abolished sandals, forcing warriors to toughen their feet by running barefoot across thorns and stones. He made them march dozens of miles at lightning speed, carrying nothing but their shields and stabbing spears. If you fell behind, well, let's just say no one wanted to find out what Shaka did with slackers. But his genius wasn't just about harsh training. He reimagined warfare itself. The famous bullhorn formation became his signature. The chest to pin down the enemy, the horns to encircle them, and the loins, yes, that's what he called it, waiting in reserve for the killing blow. Armies that once fought like unruly mobs suddenly became synchronized predators under Shaka's command. Villages didn't stand a chance. One by one, clans were absorbed, defeated, or destroyed. The Zulu Empire expanded like wildfire, and Shaka stood at the center, untouchable, unstoppable, and to many, unkillable. But here's the dark twist. Brilliance often comes with shadows. As the years passed, especially after the death of his beloved mother Nandi, Shaka began to unravel. His grief turned into paranoia, and paranoia turned into tyranny. Imagine if your boss at work lost a loved one and decided, "Everyone, we are mourning for a whole year. No celebrations, no weddings, no pregnancies allowed. And if anyone dares to break the rules, I'll have them executed." That's exactly what Shaka did. And it wasn't a metaphorical, "you'll get fired." He meant actually executed. At one point, he ordered thousands of people put to death because he felt they weren't grieving deeply enough for his mother. Crying too little? Dead. Crying too much? Suspicious. Also dead. It was a no-win situation. The kingdom became a land of tears, and not just for mourning. This wasn't the same Shaka who had once inspired loyalty with his charisma and vision. This was a man consumed by fear of betrayal, seeing enemies in every corner, even among his own family. Whispers started spreading. Warriors began to wonder, had their mighty king lost his way? Chiefs grumbled in secret, and his brothers, Dingane and Mhlangana, watched carefully. They had grown up in his shadow, and now they saw a man slipping, losing not just his grip on power, but also the trust of his people. The empire was still strong, the armies were still loyal, for now. But cracks had appeared in the foundation, and Shaka's unpredictability was making even his allies nervous. Because here's the truth about ruling by fear. It works brilliantly until the day your followers decide they're more afraid of living under you than of killing you. And for Dingane and Mhlangana, that day was approaching fast.
Living in Shaka's shadow was like living under a thunderstorm that never moved on. Every day, Dingane and Mhlangana woke up knowing their brother was larger, louder, and far more dangerous than they could ever hope to be. He was the lion. They were just jackals lingering at the edges of the kill. But here's the thing about jackals.
They're survivors, and survival has its own kind of cunning. At first, the brothers were content to play their roles. Shaka was the king, the genius, the feared one. They were princes with power, but no real authority. They enjoyed the privileges of royal blood, safety, status, food, without having to bear the crushing weight of the crown. But that arrangement began to sour as Shaka's paranoia deepened. Because when your brother rules by fear, even royal blood isn't protection. They watched as chiefs who had served faithfully for years suddenly vanished, accused of disloyalty. They saw warriors executed for the smallest infractions, sometimes for nothing more than a suspicious look. And they knew if Shaka could turn on his most loyal men, he could certainly turn on them. So the whispers began. Quiet conversations behind reed walls, glances exchanged during council meetings, subtle nods that meant, "We need to talk." They weren't just planning regicide, they were planning the most dangerous family meeting in history. But here's the question historians still debate. Were Dingane and Mhlangana cold-blooded opportunists, hungry for power? Or were they simply men trapped under the weight of a king who had become impossible to live with? Maybe it was both. On one hand, the lure of the throne was undeniable. The chance to step out of Shaka's shadow, to rule in their own right, to become more than background characters in the Zulu epic. That temptation had to be intoxicating. On the other hand, survival instincts screamed louder each day. Shaka was spiraling, and anyone close to him risked being swept away in his storm. If they didn't act, they might end up as just another set of names on the long list of people who had crossed the king. It was the ultimate gamble. Kill the lion, or wait for the lion to kill you. Every whispered word between them was soaked in danger, because if Shaka even suspected their intentions, they wouldn't live long enough to finish their sentences. Imagine sitting in your hut, planning how to kill your brother, while knowing he had spies, informants, and enough paranoia to sniff out betrayal before it even happened.
But fear is a powerful motivator, and fear eventually outweighs loyalty. So Dingane and Mhlangana made their choice. They would strike. They would gamble everything on one bold, irreversible act. The only question left was, how do you kill a man the whole kingdom believes is untouchable? Once the brothers crossed the invisible line from fear to conspiracy, there was no turning back. Dingane and Mhlangana knew the stakes. Planning to kill Shaka wasn't just high risk, it was the kind of gamble where losing meant death, not only for them, but for their families, their allies, maybe even their entire bloodline. Think about it. Plotting to kill the most paranoid man in Africa was like planning to prank a lion. There's no round two if you mess it up. The first step was silence. They couldn't afford to talk openly, not even in their huts. Shaka's spies were everywhere. Servants, warriors, even the women who brought food to the royal corral might carry whispers back to the king. So the brothers spoke in coded language, exchanged quick glances during council, and slipped away at night to whisper under the cover of darkness. Second step, allies. No assassination succeeds without help, especially against someone as heavily guarded as Shaka. They needed men they could trust with their lives, loyal to them, not the king. Finding those men was dangerous in itself. Ask the wrong warrior and he'd report you to Shaka in the morning. So they picked carefully. A handful of close attendants, a few discontented chiefs, enough muscle to strike, but few enough to keep the circle tight. The third step? Timing. Shaka wasn't an easy man to corner. He was constantly surrounded by warriors, guards, and advisors. He moved unpredictably, sometimes in the middle of the night. They had to choose a moment when his defenses were down, when the king, for just one breath, believed he was safe. But that was the hardest part. Shaka didn't trust safety. He thrived on suspicion. He suspected betrayal, sniffed for it like a hunting dog, and crushed it before it could take root, which meant Dingane and Mhlangana weren't just planning a strike, they were trying to out-paranoid the most paranoid man alive. That's what made the conspiracy so chilling. Each day they waited, each night they whispered, was another roll of the dice. Would Shaka suddenly sense something was off? Would he call one of them into his hut and say, "So, what were you whispering about last night?"
Still, the brothers pressed on. The perfect moment finally presented itself in September of 1828. Shaka, exhausted and distracted, had been acting erratically, more ruthless than ever, but also strangely vulnerable. His mother's death had left scars that time hadn't healed. The kingdom was restless. Chiefs grumbled, warriors obeyed, but reluctantly. The aura of invincibility was starting to crack. This was their window. The plan was simple in theory: lure Shaka into a moment of trust, then strike fast and mercilessly. No long speeches, no hesitation. The king had to fall before he could even draw breath to shout. And so the trap was set. Dingane and Mhlangana kept their smiles polished, their voices calm, their loyalty on display. They stood by their brother as if nothing were wrong, waiting for the moment to flip from shadows to steel. Because once they raised the spear, there would be no turning back. The die had been cast. The lion would soon be surrounded by jackals. But the question remained: when the fatal moment came, would they have the courage to actually strike? September 1828, the day that would end an era. The Zulu royal kraal lay under a restless sky, the air heavy with unease. Shaka had been different. His paranoia was sharper than ever, his grief still raw, and his mood unpredictable. One moment he was lecturing chiefs on loyalty, the next he was pacing like a man who heard ghosts whispering behind every wall. It wasn't unusual for Shaka to test those around him, to suddenly spin and ask, "What are you thinking? Tell me." Imagine living with a boss who not only micromanages, but also suspects you of plotting murder every time you blink. That was life around Shaka. And yet, despite his sharp instincts, on this day he seemed distracted. Maybe it was exhaustion, maybe it was overconfidence, or maybe fate had simply decided the lion's time was up. Inside the royal homestead, Shaka sat with Dingane and Mhlangana, his own brothers, alongside trusted attendants. At first, the conversation was normal, but under the surface, the room was buzzing with tension. Every nod, every laugh, every word was a mask.
Because only a handful of men in that hut knew the truth. Tonight, the king would not live to see another sunrise. Now, here's where history gets messy. Different accounts give different details of Shaka's last moments. Some say he was sitting by the fire when the brothers struck suddenly with spears. Others claim he was lured outside under the pretense of discussing an urgent matter and ambushed in the darkness. Still others whisper that he was suffocated quietly, held down until the lion stopped thrashing. But what every version agrees on is this: the betrayal was swift, brutal, and final. Imagine the tension in that room before the first move. The brothers must have looked at each other, silently asking, "Is it time? Are we doing this? Who goes first?" They didn't exactly draw straws for who had to go first with the spear, but you can bet nobody was rushing to stab the most dangerous man in Africa. Finally, courage or desperation broke the silence. One brother moved, the others followed. Spears were thrust, blows landed, and Shaka, caught between shock and fury, tried to resist. Some say he fought like a cornered lion, eyes blazing even as the steel pierced him. Others claim he barely had a chance, that the betrayal came too fast, too well planned. Either way, the unthinkable happened.
Shaka Zulu, the warrior king who had crushed armies, built an empire, and seemed untouchable, fell not to his enemies in battle, but to his brothers in the shadows. As he lay dying, tradition claims he spat out a final curse, warning his assassins that they too would not rule in peace. Whether he actually said it or not, the words clung to the moment, echoing down through history. The lion was dead, but notice the silence that followed. No cheering, no celebration, just the stunned stillness of men realizing they had just killed a legend. The kind of silence that asks, "What have we done, and what happens now?" The fire flickered, the night air thick with the smell of smoke and blood, and outside the hut, the Zulu kingdom remained unaware that its heartbeat had just stopped. When word finally spread, it wasn't shouted, it was whispered, quiet, nervous, unsure, because even in death, Shaka's name carried power. His brothers had won, but they also knew they had just unleashed something far bigger than themselves, the ghost of a king who had terrified an entire continent. Shaka's final day ended not with a roar on the battlefield, but with a whisper in the dark. And that whisper would haunt the Zulu kingdom forever.
When the news broke that Shaka Zulu was dead, the kingdom didn't erupt in joy or chaos. It froze. The mighty king who had terrified armies, conquered clans, and ruled with both brilliance and brutality was gone, and not at the hands of enemies, but at the spears of his own brothers. Reactions were complicated. Some chiefs breathed sighs of relief in secret, finally free from a king whose grief and paranoia had strangled their lives. Others wept genuinely, knowing they had lost a leader who had raised the Zulu from obscurity to empire. For the common people, it was confusion. Was this liberation or disaster in disguise? And then came Dingane, stepping into the role he had risked everything to claim. By blood, by opportunity, and by sheer nerve, he was now king of the Zulu. But wearing the crown of a legend is no simple thing. It's like stepping into Michael Jordan's shoes. You're instantly compared, and you'll almost certainly fall short. From day one, Dingane was haunted by his brother's shadow. He could issue orders, lead armies, and sit on the throne. But in every corner of the kraal, people whispered, what would Shaka have done? It's the problem with killing a legend. The man dies, but the myth grows stronger. Humor aside, it was a nightmare scenario. Dingane had to project strength, but everyone knew he had come to power through betrayal. It's like starting a new job where your first act was stabbing your boss in the back, literally. Not the most confidence-inspiring resume. Congratulations, you're king now, the chiefs might have thought. But the people kinda like the scary guy you just killed. And Dingane knew it. Every decision he made was clouded by the fear that loyalty to Shaka still lingered among the regiments. Every chief, every warrior could secretly be comparing him to the fallen king. He didn't just have to rule, he had to survive the shadow of his own crime. History tells us Dingane would go on to lead in his own right, but his reign was turbulent, marked by both ambition and insecurity. The truth was, no matter how strong he tried to appear, he could never fully escape the curse of betrayal. Because when you kill a lion, you don't just inherit his den, you inherit his ghost. And Shaka's ghost lingered over the Zulu kingdom, not as a spirit in the night, but as a memory in every warrior's heart, a story on every villager's lips, and a legacy that no amount of spears could silence. The aftermath wasn't just about a kingdom adjusting to a new ruler. It was about a people learning to live with the uneasy knowledge that their greatest king had fallen not in battle, but to the quiet thrust of betrayal at home.
And that scar would shape the Zulu for generations to come. Shaka Zulu may have fallen, but his legend never did. His military strategies, the bullhorn formation, the short stabbing spear, the relentless drills echoed across Africa long after his body lay in the ground. Rivals who once feared him found themselves adopting his very tactics. European powers studying the continent took notes, astonished that an African king had redefined the art of war. The irony couldn't be sharper. No army could defeat Shaka, not the Ndwandwe, not the Mtetwa, not the dozens of rival clans who shattered under his might. His downfall didn't come with war cries, but whispers, not from enemies on the battlefield, but from brothers at his side. In the end, the only spears strong enough to pierce Shaka were the ones wielded at his own hearth. That's the tragedy and brilliance of his story. Shaka was unstoppable in battle, yet vulnerable at home. History remembers him as a titan of strategy, a man whose ambition carved out an empire. And yet his final chapter reminds us that even the fiercest warrior can't always outwit bloodlines poisoned by fear and ambition. It leaves us with a haunting reflection. Was Shaka undone by the very paranoia he created, driving his brothers to strike first? Or was it simply karma, the universe balancing scales against a ruler whose grief had tipped into madness? History doesn't hand us neat answers. It hands us questions that echo across centuries. So let me ask you this. Was Shaka Zulu the victim of betrayal or the architect of his own downfall? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'd love to hear your take. Because one thing's for certain, kings may die, but legends never do.